Hey everyone, Effie here. Today I'm going to make this watercolor card using our new Riotous Wildflowers 6x6 Photopolymer stamp. I'm going to start off by white heat embossing this large image onto some watercolor paper. I'm using Canson XL 140-pound paper, and I'm using my Baron tool to help me get a nice, clean, crisp impression. For my embossing powder, I'm using Brutus Monroe Alabaster. After I've poured on my powder, I'm just going to heat set everything with my heat gun. Make sure you let it heat up for a couple of seconds before you apply the heat to minimize warping. Today I'm going to be watercoloring using Ken Oliver color bursts. I'll be using Fuchsia, Sap Green, and Gamboge to watercolor the entire image. I'm using two brushes to paint today, a fine tip water brush and a large tip water brush. I'm using the fine tip to put down the color and then the large tip to blend the color out. As I paint, you can see that the paint kind of flows freely when I apply the pigment onto the paper, and that's because that area of the paper is wet with clean water. So I make sure that prior to actually putting down any pigment onto the areas that I want to paint, I wet the area with clean water first. This is so that I get a better blend of my color. This is called a wet on wet watercolor technique. If you don't wet the paper first, you end up with some hard edges. If you like that look, sometimes I do like that look. I don't wet the paper first, but for today's card, I wanted a more soft, subtle look to my watercolor painting, so I did use the wet on wet technique. I added a little bit more depth by shading the inner portions of my floral petals. So after I applied my first layer of color and then blended it out, it was a little too light and I didn't have too much shading. So I just added a little bit more pigment just to the inner portions of the petals. When you add a bit of that darker shade into your florals, it just adds a bit more impact because you have a nice contrast. I'm going to repeat the process for all of the floral images here. After I finish painting the blooms, I'm just going to do some loose watercoloring with sap green color bursts for all of the foliage. I use the same wet on wet technique for the foliage as well, meaning that I apply clean water to the areas where all my leaves are, and then I apply just drops of sap green color bursts to the areas, and then I blend the color out. And I'm not really taking much care to stay within the lines because, again, this is just loose watercoloring and the end result is really, really nice. I used to be really OCD about coloring within the lines and making sure that my cards were oh so perfect, but I started experimenting with this loose watercoloring technique in the last few releases, and I'm really loving the result. If you've never tried this technique before, I encourage you to experiment. Try it out with the paints that you have. Try it out with different color palettes. Here I'm just using one shade of green for the foliage, but there are times where I will add a second or even third shade to the loose watercoloring, and this will just add a little bit more interest to your card. But today I wanted to keep the colors just clean and simple, so I used the fuchsia, sap green, and gamboge, and I'll start painting the gamboge in the tiny florals next. Since these little flowers are small, you don't have to take too much care about coloring them in. I kind of just add a little bit of clean water and then I just dot all the flowers with Gamboge color bursts. Once I finish painting my panel, I set it aside to completely dry, and next I'm just going to be doing some die cutting. I use the largest and smallest dies from our double stitch rectangles large die set. The large die will add stitching to the edges of my panel, and the smallest die will add a window where I'm going to stamp the sentiment. So I took an A2 size top folding card base and I laid that die cut panel over it and I made some tick marks onto the base. I'm going to be doing some blending with our Couture color inks. I'm starting off with our soft garden dye ink and I'm using a mini ink blender and I'm just going to pull some of that color up to about halfway up the window. After I finish blending our soft garden dye ink, I'm going to blend our bright fern dye ink just a little bit to add a little bit of shading and contrast. Then I temporarily adhere that die cut window onto the base, and then I stamp the sentiment in our Noir Dye ink. The sentiment is from our Peony Notes stamp sets. Then I pulled that panel off and then I put some dimensional foam tape behind it and mounted the panel onto the base. Lastly, I added some of our clear rhinestones onto my card to add a little bit of a subtle and delicate embellished touch. The card is now complete. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I hope that you'll hop along with us because we're celebrating our 3rd anniversary with some new stamps. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.